Thank you. And I have to just start by saying I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time in Arkansas. It won't be my last. And I feel, first, I just feel sort of at home. I grew up in Virginia, and I've gotten a very warm and friendly welcome here, which makes me feel at home. I also got the world's best tour of the Clinton Library. And, you know, I saw a lot of my own friends on those walls, but I also saw a concept for a library and a school and an archive that I understand that's what President Clinton said is a new way of thinking about what a presidential library can do. So I'm just thrilled to be here. The second thing to say is, you know, you heard in the introduction about this article I wrote 3 years ago, and frankly, I just have to tell you that the week before the article was published, The Atlantic was trying to get me onto various shows like Good Morning America and others, and essentially everybody was like, nah, this just isn't that interesting, it's been said before. They just weren't doing all that well with the publicity because I was not the first woman to write about the difficulties of balancing work and family. And so, you know, it took everybody by surprise, and it really did change my life. But I've now written this book, and I couldn't have written this book 3 years ago. It is not an outgrowth, I mean, it's an outgrowth of the article in the sense that because of the article I was asked to write a book, but it is a very different book than the article, and I want to start by giving you a sense of why. And really, over the last 3 years, people wrote hundreds of letters to me, emails, but personal letters, and pages telling me their life story, because I had been pretty candid about my own life, and it just seemed to unlock doors for lots of people, and mostly women, but a certain number of men, and I'm going to come back to that. And men wrote to me. And I read lots of things online. There were a lot of things online that were really unpleasant to read, so I didn't read all of those, but I did. You know, there were days I thought, I don't have to read horrible stuff about myself all day. I can stop, and I did. But I also, you know, had conversations with audiences like this one. I've given many speeches, and I would talk, and then I would get a question. I would, you know, get questions from the audience, and a lot of those questions challenged what I'd said, and I would think about it. And I came to see my own family differently. This is what has really changed the most. Partly I found out things about them that I didn't know. My father had always raised me to have a career, and one of my friends wrote me and said, you know, your dad was really ahead of his time in Virginia in the 60s, raising his daughter to have a career. My dad didn't raise me to have a career. I mean, this is, you know, I was born in 1958, so this is still the 60s and the early 70s. And so I wrote my dad, and I said, you know, yeah, why did you? And he said, I didn't expect his answer. He's a lawyer, and he was representing women in the 60s. This was the first big wave of divorces for all sorts of reasons. And these were women who had typically put their husbands through graduate school, law or medicine or whatever they were doing, raised the kids, and then when their husbands left them, they had no way of supporting themselves. You know, they would get alimony or whatever, but they were basically left high and dry. And my father said, as a dad, he was determined that his daughter would never be in that position. And that was interesting to me, because I'd always thought Dad wanted me to have a career to be like him, or, you know, for his ambition for me as a daughter. It never had dawned on me that this was a father who was saying, as a father, I want my daughter to always be able to support herself. And then I came to see my mother differently. And this is probably the biggest change. 3 years ago, if you'd asked me about my mother, I'd have said she's an artist, she's a painter and a sculptor. She has been painting for 40 years. She has pieces and collections up and down the East Coast and in Belgium and other places. She's a wonderful artist. And if you ever came to my house, it looks like the Museum of Mom's Art. It is. But I'd have told you that with great pride. I would not have said she was a homemaker for most of my childhood. She really only started painting full-time after I left. After I left, my brother and I left home. I wouldn't have told you that because I was basically raised that, you know, her professional stuff, that was great. You're going to talk about that. But but you wouldn't talk about her as a homemaker. That's not something you would have been proud of as a woman in my generation. And now I look at her and my father, and they're both over 80, and I look at the family they built, and of course they both built it, but my mother invested much more time in my two brothers and I. And I look at all three of us, and we're all productive citizens, and I think I can't do any of the things I've done without that family foundation. You know, and it's not just what she did when I was young, but even today, you know, my family is my foundation. If something's going wrong, anywhere in the family, it's like a grapevine, right? We support each other. We are all married. We all have children. We love hanging out with each other. We are not perfect. This is not the Waltons, for any of you who remember the Waltons, and not the Arkansas Waltons, the TV show Waltons. You know, we're not perfect. We have fights like any family, and we have ups and downs like any family. But I look at my mother now, and I look at my father's work as a lawyer, and my mother's work as a homemaker, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter to our own parents. And I think her work is just as important as her work as an artist or my father's work as a lawyer. And that has been the biggest change over the last 3 years, that I have come to see that her investing in us is just as important, indeed from a national policy perspective, even more important than anything she has done as an artist, even though I think she's a spectacular artist and she's created beauty, and that my father's done as a lawyer. So that's where I want to start this conversation, and it really has been a process of re-education of my own views. And I start the book by talking about what I now see as my experience hitting a tipping point. And this is where I want to make clear that, you know, in the book and right here, I will say I tip my hat, if I had one, to Sheryl Sandberg and the work she's done in Lean In. I think it's extremely important. I, as a boss, have had 3 young women come and ask me for raises after they read Lean In. And I'm a little torn. On the one hand, the feminist in me says, yes, absolutely, you should do that. And the boss in me says, well, not necessarily. I mean, I can't hand out raises just because people ask them for them. But I really do see the work she's done, and I tip my hat to that. But I also say that it's very important, but it's not enough, because in the first place, you can only lean in if you have an incredible support system. I mean, if I lean right here and lean far enough, I'm going to fall over unless somebody is holding my feet. And that is the equivalent of that support system that we need. So men, you know, who've been able to go hard in their careers, they've had a support system at home. And if women are going to go hard, they need a support system at home. And sometimes, even when you have a great support system, because I had a husband who was willing to be lead parent. He was taking care of our sons 5 days a week. And I had enough money to have a housekeeper, and I had a lot of advantages, including a strong family. And even so, my elder son had a really rocky adolescence. And by the standards of teenagehood, he sure wasn't the worst. But he was making bad choices. And that's not because we were bad parents, and it's not because he was a bad kid. It's because, you know, he hit middle school in a certain way, and he got in with some bad friends, and that can happen to anybody. And, you know, you can have a child with special needs. You can have a divorce. You can rely on your extended family for care, and then you have to move or they have to move. That's what life is. It's unpredictable things. And, you know, I feel like, obviously I'd love to be up here saying, you can do it, of course you can do it. But I feel like, look, we've got to be honest about what has happened to millions of women, most of them with far fewer advantages than I had, who hit a tipping point. Not because they didn't want to lean in, and not because they weren't ambitious, but because life happened. And frankly, lots of men too have made decisions about their careers when their families had to come first. We just don't focus on them as much. Last thing I'll say about the tipping point is, and I've hinted at this, you know, I wrote that article in the Atlantic focused on the women at the top. And when we talk about advancing women, we naturally focus on the women at the top because that's what we can count. You know, the most frequent metric and the sort of easiest one is, well, there are 500 Fortune 500 CEOs. How many of those are women? Because, you know, that's just like the easiest metric in the world. There should be 250 and there are 29. I mean, obviously they're never going to be exactly 250, but 29 is definitely not equality, given that an equal number of men and women come out of business school. Something's going on there. Or you think, how many women professors are there, or deans, or presidents, or senators? That's important, but what we're missing is that there are too few women at the top, and there are far too many at the bottom. And when we talk about advancing women, we don't focus on the women at the bottom. It's what I call an unlovely symmetry, right? Too few at the top, way too many at the bottom. The majority of minimum wage workers are women. 2/3 of shift workers are women. The poorest women in our society are overwhelmingly single mothers. Single fathers are also likely to be much worse off, but there are far more single mothers than there are single fathers. Women of color, who are typically giving care to others, are often very low paid and much more likely to be at the bottom of the income distribution. So when I talk about a tipping point, you know, a woman who's in a career who needs to take time out for care may not advance in her career. A woman at the bottom whose child needs her to be there for a couple of days can lose her job. Right? There's no paid family leave. She can lose her job, she'll get docked pay, she will not be promoted. The problems of the tipping point are far worse at the bottom. So so the way I now think about this issue, that anybody can hit a tipping point, and really what is happening here is that when people have to take time to care for each other, which is essential, somebody does have to take care of children and parents and the ill and the disabled. That's just part of what makes the society run. When that happens, you are seriously disadvantaged in this society. Whether if you're a woman at the top, you get knocked off the leadership track. If you're a woman at the bottom, much worse things happen. So then, how do we think about that problem? Well, you've already heard me make one move, right? I said it's not a women's problem, it's a care problem. And actually, if you look at pay gaps, we still need equal pay across the board. But women without caregiving obligations, they're doing okay. I mean, they're not there yet, but they're at somewhere between 90 to 96%, or 90 to 96 cents on every male dollar. It's not there, but it's looking pretty good. Mothers are 72 cents on the male dollar, right? They are way below. It is the women with caregiving obligations that have the biggest problem. So I call that a care problem, not a women's problem. And then I say that's actually a work problem. This is not a women's problem. It is the problem of a 21st century workforce that includes 60% of American women and over 70% of American mothers, and an even higher percent of mothers whose kids are in school age. Not surprising, they're supporting their families. That's the workforce, right? The workforce is women and men, and they all have caregiving obligations. The workplace is still stuck in the middle of the 20th century. And even the younger folks in this audience have seen Leave It to Beaver, thanks to Nickelodeon. We still assume June Cleaver's at home, right? The assumption of the workplace is that when school gets out, let's just start with that. You know, school gets out at 3. I don't know any workplace that says, oh, go home at 3 o'clock and pick up your kids. Not to mention summer vacations and teacher development days and a million other things. But of course, when the school nurse calls, and would frequently call me in Washington, and I would be like, I'm 3.5 hours away. I'm not sure what you want me to do. My husband is at home, you can call him. But even so, he has a job too. So when the school nurse calls, when there are the school trips, when there are the countless things that you have to do, and if you're taking care of a parent, obviously that's completely unpredictable as to when that parent may need you, may fall, may need to go to the doctor, all of that. That is true for women and increasingly for men, but the workplace is structured for a very different workforce. So this is a work problem. Now, okay, you say, all right, well, so, lots of women work part-time, don't work full-time, okay. Well, but that's a huge economic loss for our companies, right? Just imagine this in reverse. Imagine that 50% women, 50% men start out in the workforce, and then 20 years later, you've lost anywhere 30 to 40% of those men, right? So, in a good industry, 20% men are at the top. In a bad industry, 5% men are at the top. You have lost 20%, 30%, 35%, 45% of the men. Wouldn't we think that that was a problem for the businesses? Wouldn't we think, whoa, wait a minute, you recruited all these people, you trained all these people, and then they all left, and you had to start over and recruit more people and train more people? I can tell you, running a 200-person organization, losing good employees and having to start over and run the search costs and find somebody and train them, that is a huge investment. And if you lose those people, often the people you find are not as good as the people you lost, that's a waste. It's just a waste of the investment that you have put in. The second thing, as we know, you're losing diversity, right? We now have reams of research about what diversity does for the bottom line. And it's not all that surprising if you think about it. You need multiple perspectives no matter what profession you're in. And the third thing is that businesses is losing out on the people who have the skills that investing in others gives you. Because that's what care is, right? Competition or self-interest or however you want to think about it, that's investing in yourself. And it's great. I'm a very, very competitive person. My grandfather was an All-American football player from Michigan. I like to compete, and that's what drives us, right? To invest in your school, in your jobs, competition's investing in yourself to pursue a goal. Care is investing in others. And what you do when you invest in others is a combination of giving them the knowledge and the support and the guidance and the discipline they need, right? We do all that, we invest in them, we teach them things, we discipline them, all that. But it's also this stepping back. And that's the hard part often. The hardest part for me as a parent, is it's one thing to let your toddler fall down, although that can be hard too, but you gotta the child's gotta do that, otherwise they don't learn to walk. It's even harder to let your teenager drive off in your car, right? And it's harder still to let your teenager make decisions that you think are the wrong ones within limits, because they've gotta learn, because that's the only way they grow. Those skills, and it's this combination of investment and patience and active engagement and restraint and adapting to constantly changing rhythms, those skills, that's what a good manager does. Right? A good manager has a team and supports that team and teaches them what they need to know and guides them and disciplines them, and we don't call it that in the workplace, but when things go wrong, there are consequences. And a good manager also knows how to let people make mistakes. A management manual calls that empowering your team. A parenting manual calls that letting your children, develop their full potential. But it's the same thing. So the other thing that corporations are losing, aside from talent and their own investment and diversity, they're losing a lot of the skills that actually make for the best managers and leaders. And there's just no question in my own life that I'm a much better manager because I'm a mother, because I have to do this all the time. And there are all sorts of other things it teaches you, like profound humility, right? My sons are not only are they very good at preventing me from getting a swelled head ever, they are also, I tell them to do things, and then I go do those very things. Like I say, don't procrastinate. Don't procrastinate, terrible. Procrastinate. And then of course I go upstairs and hang out on social media for a half an hour or an hour before I sit down and write. And that often makes me think, well, wait a minute, is it okay for me to tell them do as I do, not as I say, or do as I say, not as I do? So lots of things that I think we have not understood, that investing in others in your home life and your work life, a lot of transferable skills. The last thing I'll say about the corporate sector is, and how we have to think of this as a work problem, is that if you let people work as responsible adults and you focus on the work, not on the time they put in, what I call time macho, then you really can make this much, much better for lots of people, including in lower income jobs. There are all sorts of ways to do this. And a lot of corporations have flexibility policies, but they also have flexibility stigma. And that, we are not fighting that, right? So they say, of course, you can work part-time, or of course, you can work from home 1 day a week, or you can come in late or leave early or whatever. And the minute you do that, you are now no longer on leadership track. You are now not going to get that promotion. You are not in the bonus pool. That is something we have to fight head on, because in the first place, it's hypocrisy. You can't say this is what you allow and then actually those are the formal rules, but these are the real rules. If you do it, you are not really a player. But second, you know, you haven't lost IQ points because you work part-time. You really haven't. You know, you haven't lost all the experience you built up, and you're not even less ambitious. I am plenty ambitious. It's just that I'm ambitious for lots of things, and one of them is having children and actually enjoying having those children, and two is doing right by them. I don't want to look back at the end of my life and think I sacrificed my family to my career. That's not part of what I'm ambitious for. But I'm still plenty ambitious for my career. So we have to take this head on. We have to just say, no, 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 no. You can't have these policies, but then actually devalue the people who take advantage of them. And believe me, this is going to be as important for men as it is for women, which brings me to the next part of the book. There's lots more in the book. I always feel nervous giving these talks because then I think, well, why is anybody going to read the book? Because I just told you what's in the book. But there's lots more in the book. The next big piece of this that I didn't know 3 years ago is that this is about men as much as it is about women. Now we know, there's been lots of stuff about how women have to help, and men have to help women, that men have to push for women. Yes, I'm all for that, and I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for feminist men in my life who had powerful wives and who wanted to help women get ahead, and they nurtured me and mentored me, absolutely. But I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the men who wrote me after the article came out and said, you think I have it all, but I want a very different balance between how much I have to work and how much time I get to spend with my children or my spouse or my parents. I want to be able to be at my kids' baseball games. I want to be able to be there at their recitals. I want to be part of their lives. I want to play the same role in their lives that their mothers do, but I have no choice about this. I am the breadwinner, and that is what society expects me to be, and if I try to do anything else, I not only will be told I'm not committed to my career, which women are told to, I'll be told I'm not really a guy. And that got me thinking. And I talked to lots of people, including members of my own family, and one guy said in this letter that he wrote to me, he said, I'm saying this, and you're probably thinking to yourself, all right, so this guy wants it, but that's not what most men want. And then he wrote, that's what men said about women in the 60s and the 70s. Men said women wanted to be at home. Women didn't want to compete. That was the rough and tumble of the workplace. Their wives didn't want this. Just as many women, I think, now say, my husband doesn't want this. But lo and behold, when women had the choice and it became valued, lots of us wanted to have both, right? We didn't want to give up on family, but we sure did want to be able to have careers. And men are now, you know, I looked at my sons and I realized I am raising my sons, I looked at my sons and I thought if I had a daughter, I'd be raising her completely differently than my mother was raised. Just completely differently. My mother was told she couldn't go to med school because it would have been a waste of an investment because she was going to get married, and what was the point? If I had daughters, I'd be certainly telling them they could be doctors or anything else. And I would be telling them they could be mothers and wives and daughters and sisters. But I'm looking at my sons and I'm thinking, I'm raising my sons the way my father was raised. I'm raising my sons to be breadwinners because that's their choices. And that won't work. You cannot change women's roles and say, okay, women, you were caregivers, now you're caregivers and breadwinners. But men, nope, you're just breadwinners. That means women have 2 jobs and men have 1. So it's not going to work that way, but it's also not fair to men. You know, it's fabulous being a mom and being needed by my kids and feeling that I'm investing in them and that no matter what else happens at the end of my life, that will be something I did. Why shouldn't men have that too? Why shouldn't men have exactly that same set of choices? Women are going to need them too because women CEOs will need male lead parents, but men should be wanting to. And what I've heard is that many more men want to than we think. All right, for the skeptics among you, because many of you are thinking, yeah, sure. Yeah, right. Not the men in my family. But okay, 3 quick examples. Madison Avenue. So I was listening to ESPN the other day, and Honda was running an ad for a Civic, and that said, this is what soccer dads need. And it went through this whole thing about soccer dads. Like, you think it's about soccer moms? Nope, there are soccer dads out there, and this is the car for soccer dads. And at the end of it, it said, a Honda Civic. Big enough for you. This is ESPN, so okay, I'm stereotyping, but it's a larger male audience than a female audience. Big enough for you, your kids, and your self-respect. Okay, so somebody at Honda thinks there's a market out there. And in fact, watch the Super Bowl ads, and I go through them in my book, and watch how many of them are now being targeted at guys who are saying things like, you know, I gave up the corner office for, you know, the school run. You can watch them online. I didn't make this up. Second, the military. Right, so a number of men who have written me and my husband, who just wrote an article about being lead parent, military men are writing in saying, yeah, you know, I was deployed and now I'm back and it's my wife's turn because she held the family together, and now it's my turn to be lead parent, and she's going to go back to school, she's going to pursue her passion. So that's one area, and they're not worried about their masculinity, and they shouldn't be. But 2, if we got women soldiers, who do we think is anchoring those families when the women are deployed? It's got to be the guys. So I think there's a change among the military. And the third thing I'll just say is millennials as a whole, if compensation is meaning and money, which is the way you to think about compensation. I know, I work in the nonprofit sector. We're high on meaning and low on money. So believe me, I know about this. Millennials want a different balance or different composition of meaning and money. Millennials as a whole, this isn't about families. They want to work out. They want to volunteer. They want to have a life, a radical concept for some of us work-obsessed people, and I include myself. And 50% of male MBAs, on a study that Bain released last week, 50% of male MBAs said they expected to put their family ahead of their career at some point in their work life. MBAs. So you may think that, you know, I'm making this up about men, but we've got Madison Avenue and military men and millennials to prove you different. Okay, let me close up just by saying I've been talking about what we can do, how we ought to think and talk, and what men can do as well as women, how we should define this problem. I want to close by, since we're here in the Clinton School, I want to say the last piece of this is we really can't do this alone. Right? And again, I am all for lean in, and I have bought more self-improvement books than anybody out there. So many that sometimes we have 2 copies because I couldn't remember that I'd already bought 1. I'm all for that, but we cannot do this one woman at a time and one business at a time, one CEO at a time. There's some of this we have to do as voters, because you cannot run a society that needs to invest in its children. And just parenthetically, you know, those first 5 years of a child's life, you're actually shaping that child's brain. You're not just teaching it things, you are shaping its brain, and you are determining his or her ability to learn for the rest of his or her life. You can't run a society and allow us to care for each other without paid family leave. You just can't do it. It can't be that you have to choose between your job and your child or your parent or your spouse or whoever else needs care. And we have to have maternity and paternity leave. My point is, men and women have to be able to provide care and cash. Well, then men need to be able to bond with their children right at the beginning. Because so much of this is path dependence. It's not like a mother knows what to do with a baby, or at least I didn't. Right? You figure it out. But if you're the one who has maternity leave and he doesn't have paternity leave, then you figure it out, and then he is going to be the helper forevermore because you're the competent one. So you've got to have your time, and then he has his time, and you're both equal. And believe me, having done this in my own family, you will not always agree about what to do from thenceforward. But at least you are both equal parents. So we need maternity leave and paternity leave. And finally, we need all sorts of subsidies, incentives. I don't care how we do this for quality, affordable childcare and elder care. Childcare costs more than rent in all 50 states. And that's driving caregivers out of the workforce, still more women. We're actually going backwards in terms of the number of women in the workforce, and that's a hit to our GDP, because the more women you add, the more we grow. So we have to do this together. We'll do this in an American way. As Hillary Clinton said the other day, we're not going to be Denmark. We're really not going to be Denmark. We're not going to be France or Germany or whatever. We're going to do this our way, but the government has to set the standards. The government has to make the market and then allow different businesses to compete within it. Because otherwise, good companies who try to offer these things on their own will get driven out by companies that don't. Okay, so we've got to do this. We got to think about this in terms of what happens. Life happens. We hit tipping points. It's not your fault. We have to think about this as a work problem, not a women's problem. We have to think about men being equal as much as women being equal. We have to do this as citizens. And now you may be thinking, well, boy, I know she's a professor. She just like imagines whole different worlds and writes books about them. And, you know, it's lovely in that ivory tower. Has she ever lived in the real world? Has she ever lived in my world? Okay, so why do I think we can do this? Because when I was growing up, as I've told you, in Virginia in the 60s, my mother gave dinner parties and would set out little vases of cigarettes for her guests. That's what I know, young people are like, what? You know, you might as well like hand out drugs. No, that's what you did. Everybody smoked. Everybody smoked. This was Virginia, but pretty much everybody smoked across the country. And that's what you did. Good dinner. So that was, I'm not that old. That was when I was growing up. And we were only 10 years away from Jim Crow. In fact, we were probably 5 years away from Jim Crow in lots of parts of where I was in Virginia. There was certainly, you know, schools were still completely segregated. You know, and that was the way it had always been. And I don't think anybody could have conceived of gay marriage. I don't think they could have. I try to imagine my parents in the 60s and 70s and trying to describe what that was, and there would have been no comprehension whatsoever. That was true even 5 years ago. And we're not, you know, obviously this is still controversial in many parts of the country, including probably here. But, you know, Supreme Court, headed by a conservative majority, has ruled that same-sex marriage is a right. So I'm not that old, and if we could move from smoking as something everybody does to smoking as something you really don't want to do and try to quit, and it's certainly not something you'd encourage others to do, to an African-American president, to same-sex marriage, then simply completing the women's movement and saying that real equality for men and women means the equality of the work women used to traditionally did and the work men traditionally did, and means that men have an equal right and ability and competence to invest in others and their families as they do to earn an income just as women do. I just don't think that's such a big lift. I think it's the unfinished business of the women's movement, and I think we can finish it if we just make up our minds to do that. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for questions. Please raise your hands and we'll get the microphone to you. Yes, right here. Get the microphone to you.
My name is Joyce Ajayi. I'm a cleaning school student. I'm a graduate student here. And my question is, I'm from Nigeria. I've heard you speak in Nigeria at the time.
Ah, wonderful, I remember.
In Lagos.
Yep.
So my question is actually about influencing policies.
Yeah.
Now, how do you help a community, for example, that does not believe in the education of a girl child to translate from that situation into believing in the education of their children without desecrating their values or disregarding their traditions?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad you asked that question. And you will have noticed, although I'm a foreign policy person, this was a very U.S.-focused talk. I'm looking at the condition of women in the U.S. and in other developed countries more. But you're describing the first step one of the very first steps toward real equality, and an essential one. So I think you start by making an economic argument. Right? So I'm going to use the example of Japan, right, where women, Japanese is so gendered that women speak a different language than men do, right? There are different verbs, there's different tones of voice. I don't speak Japanese, so I can't do this, but it is a deeply gendered society. And yet, Prime Minister Abe has realized that he can add 15% to his GDP if he employs women. So at the national level, you make the economic case. You say, Nigeria needs to grow. Nigeria will grow, and you can do the numbers to the extent it employs its entire workforce. Right? We know that really the way we've kept the American economy growing from the 70s and kept living standards even roughly the same as women have joined the workforce. So this is a huge economic growth factor. That's where I would start. And then I would say, so that means, yes, you've got to educate women. How you educate them, where you educate them, they may need still to be in single-sex schools. We were for a very long time. I think what's important is an education, not fighting for co-education. And then with respect to individual communities, you try to reinterpret religious texts, which you certainly can do, and there are lots of scholars, Islamic scholars who are doing this, and in Christianity it's not so hard to do. And you try to find elders with daughters who want to educate their daughters. And that's actually still true here. I say it's a feminist secret weapon to find a senior man who's got daughters he's proud of. So I think those are ways you can work within the culture rather than saying, you should be modern, you should have your women educated. It took us a long time to get here too.
Good. Ms. Abrams.
I'm excited about seeing you, Ann. My name is Annie Abrams.
Pleasure to meet you.
I'm 84 years old.
Wow.
5 generations from slavery.
Wow.
I'm a futurist and a global citizen. My question is that as I listen to you and I've read about you and what you said, as a futurist, and science is changing everything, as a 5th generation from slavery, as a teenager, I knew there were homosexual partners in my community, educators. As a 1950 graduate, I knew what it meant to look forward to this day and to see these students in the Clinton School. My question to you is going to deal with Hillary Clinton's grandbaby. She brags about being a grandmother. I'm a great-grandmother. And I told her that I was not going to deal with that grandbaby as trying to follow the Clinton Charlotte name.
Right.
I told her to tell her daughter that as far as I'm concerned, her name is Cece. Little Cece.
I like that.
My question is, how do you perceive little Cece and the world that she will live in, the scientific evolutionary world, where we'll all live longer and we'll all be able to communicate in all languages with our iPads? What advice do you give me, an 84-year-old futurist who's a global citizen? That's why they call me Helen Thomas. I knew her just like I know you.
Why we call you Helen Thomas is because you ask long questions like Helen Thomas.
So the first thing, so I love that. Your life and what you've just described is exactly why I believe we can make this change, right? You have seen changes that nobody you were growing up with could have imagined. It's not just not believing we could get there, we couldn't even imagine that kind of change. So I thank you for your question. So let me say a couple things just on sort of big change. Two things you mentioned that I think are very important. So one, yes, when I'm in California, there are folks in California who talk very seriously, and they mean it, about the end of death. Now, I frankly still find that to be quite frightening, because I want to live a good long time, but I'm not sure I want to live forever. But they are serious, and I'm not sure they're going to get to the end of death, but I have talked to people who say, if you're going to plan for our children's lifetime, certainly for Charlotte Clinton's lifetime, you should expect that she may well live to 120 as just a start-off point, right? I mean, and these are people who tell you if you're investing to take care of a child who may have special needs, you should plan that she will live to 120. So now, the first thing I'd say about that, boy, if you knew you were going to live to 120, you've got time for multiple careers, and you sure have time for care, right? How crazy is it to miss the 20 years of your children's lives when they're at home, and depending how many children you have, because you want to advance in your career? You're going to, what, you're going to retire at 60 and have another 60 years, and what you're going to do what? Because I don't think they're going to change our ability to have children at 60, 70, 80, 90. I mean, maybe, I don't want to go there, but my point is that so we should be thinking about what I call intervals where we're investing in our work, and then intervals where we're investing in our children, our grandchildren, our parents, our grandparents, right? That wonderful family that is, and community. Again, I've been talking about a biological family, but you can construct a family just as well. Many of my former students I consider to be members of our extended family. So that's the first thing. And the second is to say that we are just at the very beginning of the digital revolution. We're about where we were, I don't know, 20 years after James Watt discovered a steam engine. But well before we got to full locomotives, much less the rest of it. When you talk to people who really understand digital manufacturing, and I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but digital printing, 3D printing, it's just the beginning. We're basically going to go back to local manufacturing. We're going to go back to cottage industry. You're going to be able to make whatever you want where you live, because machines will send digital instructions to other machines as to how to make the tools. And we all did live in our villages and our cities, and we made what we needed. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, and we all went to big cities and to the workplace and to offices. That's going to change. So what I would say is, you want to hang on and keep hanging on and keep having babies and grandbabies, and you want to understand that they should be preparing for a life that is pretty much unimaginable to many of us today. Thank you.
Mr. Dietz, right here.
Your opinion on why America has not so far chosen a female as our leader. There are world leaders in lots of places that are women.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I can say I profoundly hope that will change very soon. I run a nonpartisan organization, but I am also standing in the Clinton School, and I am a Democrat, so I won't say any more. But as officially, I don't take a position. But I think this is an interesting question. I would note that the women who have been at the heads of other nations have outmen the men, right? Maggie Thatcher sure wasn't there as a feminist. She was an anti-feminist. And I think if you think about Golda Meir, and if you think about Indira Gandhi, these were women who really got there in a male system, and they were not talking about women's issues, and they were not advocating women. They were kind of the way the first women often are. They have to be men. In the US, and Angela Merkel is different, but Angela Merkel, again, she doesn't have children, she's a physicist, and she's from East Germany. All three of those have, I think, a factor in how she made it. I think in this country, being the president really is about being the commander-in-chief as much as anything else. Right? I mean, we have the biggest military in the world by a factor of 10, right? We are way ahead. And we have been involved in wars pretty much continually. So that when people look at that leader, they think, can this person command the military? Can this person be commander-in-chief? And I think women, that's a really, really high bar for a lot of women. And I think the reason Hillary is doing as well as she is nobody has any doubt that she's tough enough. But you remember in the last election, what did she have to advertise? Who do you want to be at the other end of that 3 a.m. phone call? Right? It wasn't, I'm going to rebuild your economy. It was, who do you trust with your security? And she had to be on the Armed Services Committee, and that was not an accident. So that's part of it, I think.
Yes, Emily, right here. Here we go. I'll get this.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Emily Kearns. I'm part of Class 11, and I'm here as a mother of 4 and a graduate student in her 40s, and I'm wondering, and looking forward to reading your book, by the way, but I'm wondering, does your book talk about the unique challenges that women who made the choice not to go into the workforce earlier and waited until their children were older and trying to get in now, how that differs from women who left the workforce and the challenges they're facing?
Yep. It does. And this, I mean, honestly, since I've been on this book tour, I'm one of the things I keep sort of telling, particularly corporate audiences, is there's just such a talent pool out there. I mean, you are describing it, right, of very talented women who either were educated before and left, or who are getting their education now and going into the workforce. But they are all women somewhere between 45 and 55. And again, if you look at life expectancy, they've got 10 or 20 or more years ahead of them. I mean, if Hillary is elected, she'll be 70, right? And so if you are, 55, you're thinking, well, I got plenty of time there. And so that is a talent pool that we are just not using. But the two biggest investment banks, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, are both running returnship programs. So now those are for women who are coming back in, but they are equally eligible if they're going to be taking women in that demographic. The idea is that you can start and you can rotate around and you can figure out where you want to be, just as you would if you were starting out and you were 25 or 30. And then you can get the training you need, and you can start at you may be doing work competing with younger people, or you may be doing work that takes advantage of some of your greater experience. But the point is to change the image of workers so that older workers can be seen next to younger workers and evaluated again on the work, not the workers. That's one thing, that companies are realizing there's talent there they're not catching. And the second is that's going to happen more and more because those of us who are in the workforce cannot afford to retire. So I'm the height of the baby boom. I was born in 1958. As I age, the baby boom becomes an elder boom, and we've all seen this 10,000 people retiring every day. But people can't afford to retire. I mean, even those of us who know better and had the ability to put away enough money probably haven't put away enough money. Most people haven't had that choice, which means older workers are going to start working part-time, project-based differently than younger workers, but they will stay in the workforce. So I'll be honest, it is still hard, no question, but there are signs of that changing. And again, it's an economic argument and a demographic argument, which means those are two very important forces.
I know we have more questions.
Oh dear.
But we also have a lot of people that want to visit with Anne Marie Slaughter as she signs unfinished business. So if you have unfinished business with your questions, come talk to Anne Marie. Dean Slaughter, thank you very much for being here.